The tale of the girl who tried to steal my boyfriend and how I finally took back my life. I always thought high school was a battlefield of petty drama and cliques. But nothing could have prepared me for Megan. She wasn't just any girl. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and made everyone else feel like they were barely breathing. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect everything, and apparently she had set her sights on my boyfriend Tony. I still remember the first day I noticed her. Tony and I had been dating for almost a year, solidly and unapologetically. I trusted him. But something about the way Megan laughed at his jokes, the way she lingered around him during lunch, sent a cold sinking feeling straight to the pit of my stomach. It started small. A lingering glance here, a touch on the shoulder there. Tony. Being Tony didn't even notice. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overreacting. She's just friendly, I told myself. But I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. Every time she was near, there was a silent war in my mind of jealousy, fear, and frustration. The first big warning came during our group project in history class. Megan was assigned to my group, and the way she started hovering near Tony felt intentional. She'd accidentally brush his hand while pointing at something in his notebook, then give him that teasing, playful smile. And Tony, completely oblivious, smiled back. I tried subtlety first. I joined in on the conversation more aggressively, placed my hand over his when he reached for a pen, and laughed a little louder at his jokes. But Megan didn't back down. In fact, she seemed to thrive on my presence, as if my attempts to assert myself only fueled her game. The next day, I found a note slipped into my locker. No signature, just 3 words in bold, precise handwriting. He is mine. My stomach dropped. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as a joke, but deep down I knew it was her. Megan had decided I was in her way, and now she was making it official. That weekend, I confided in my best friend Lily. She's trying to take Tony, I said, pacing back and forth in my living room. I can feel it. I can't let her. I can't. Lily put a hand on my shoulder. Nora, you trust Tony, right? Of course I do, I snapped, frustrated at myself for even doubting him. But Megan, she's not normal. She's manipulative, and she's good at it. I know, Lily said, eyes sympathetic, but maybe don't let it consume you. If Tony's the one, he'll see through her. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But over the next few weeks, Megan escalated. She'd show up wherever Tony and I hung out, the library, the coffee shop, even the small comic book store where we went every Thursday. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. She was calculated, and the worst part? She wasn't subtle anymore. One afternoon, I walked into the library to find Megan sitting right across from Tony, leaning forward, laughing at something he said while her hand brushed his leg. My chest tightened, and I had to remind myself to breathe. Tony looked up, caught my glare, and frowned. He came over to where I was standing. Nora, what's wrong? She's everywhere, I muttered. It's like she's trying to take you. Tony chuckled nervously. Nora, come on, she's just friendly. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to tell him how brazen she was, how obvious, but I bit my tongue. I couldn't let him see me as the jealous girlfriend. Not yet. I needed a plan, and that's when I realized I couldn't just sit back. Megan wasn't going to stop. She was persistent, manipulative, and dangerously confident. If I wanted to protect what was mine, I had to fight smarter, not harder. The next Monday, I approached school with a sense of determination I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew Megan's type. The girls who thrived on attention. The ones who believed they could have anything they wanted as long as they tried hard enough. And Tony, he was too nice, too polite, too trusting. The perfect target. I decided to start by observing. I followed her patterns, noted the times she appeared around Tony, the jokes she used, the way she laughed at his smallest gestures. Everything was a clue. I treated it like a game, my own strategy to reclaim my relationship. During lunch, Megan was at it again, sitting next to Tony with that smug, knowing smile. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to approach like I belonged. I slid into the bench across from him. Hey, I said casually, grabbing my lunch bag. Tony's face lit up at the sight of me, and for a moment my heart relaxed. "Hey, Nora," he said, smiling. Megan's smile faltered slightly, like she just realized the battlefield had shifted. I kept it light, joking with Tony, sharing little stories from the weekend. But all the while, I noticed Megan's eyes on us. I could almost see her calculating, planning her next move. She leaned in, trying to interrupt with a story about her weekend trip. But I cut her off with a sharp laugh and an anecdote Tony found genuinely funny. The first victory, but Megan wasn't done. Over the next few days, she began subtle sabotage. She'd leave little hints of coincidental plans to get Tony alone. She texted him incessantly during class, always a second behind me, trying to be cute, flirtatious, and insistent. And Tony, being the genuinely sweet guy he was, never thought twice about replying politely. I couldn't just hope he'd see through it. I needed proof. I needed leverage, so I started recording. Not obvious, not confrontational, just little snippets of the interactions that were too frequent to be innocent. The way she leaned in, the way her hand lingered, the texts that had just a bit too much flirtation. Every little thing I could gather, I saved. But it wasn't enough to expose her. It wasn't about shaming her. It was about protecting Tony from being manipulated. And that was the line I drew in my mind. I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting to safeguard what I already had. The tension reached its peak one Thursday evening at the comic book store. Tony and I were browsing through the new arrivals when Megan appeared out of nowhere, holding 2 coffees and a stack of comics. She plopped down beside Tony with that infuriating grin, clearly expecting him to welcome her intrusion. I felt something. Snap. I grabbed Tony's arm, gently but firmly. "Tony, come on," I said. "Let's go check out the new arrivals over there." He hesitated, and Megan tilted her head, smiling. "Don't you want to see the new issue with me?" I didn't reply. I led Tony away, walking just far enough to make my point clear. Boundaries had been set. Megan didn't follow immediately, but I knew she was plotting her next move. She always was. That night, I sat on my bed, notebook in hand, planning. Every day, every interaction, every little subtle maneuver she made was documented. I turned the tension into fuel, using it to strategize my next steps. And in that planning, I started to feel a sense of control I hadn't had since this all began. By the time the following week rolled around, I had a plan. A real, actionable plan. Megan had crossed the line too many times for me to simply react anymore. I needed to take control. But this wasn't going to be a grand confrontation. I had learned early on that the more aggressive I got, the more she thrived. Megan fed off drama, thrived on the chaos she caused. No, I needed a subtle approach. A strategy that would expose her without turning Tony against me. It started with small boundaries that I enforced consistently. At school, whenever Megan appeared around Tony, I made sure I was present, engaging him in conversation. I sat closer to him in class, smiled at him in ways only we shared, whispered inside jokes that only he would respond to. Megan's eyes flicked toward us more and more often, frustration slowly replacing that smug smile she wore so easily, but subtlety wasn't enough. Megan began testing limits. During lunch one afternoon, she placed herself directly across from Tony and me, leaning over as if the table were hers. She started making comments about how fun it would be if we all hung out this weekend. Glancing at Tony with a wink. My heart sank, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of an obvious reaction. Instead, I leaned in toward Tony, laughing softly at something he said, letting my hand brush against his under the table, small, deliberate. A silent claim that was impossible to misread. Megan's smirk faltered. She realized that my presence wasn't just background noise anymore. The first real confrontation came that evening. Tony and I had gone to our usual comic shop, hoping for a quiet night of browsing. Megan appeared like clockwork, holding the very issue we'd been hunting for. She plopped down beside him with a grin, clearly expecting him to welcome her intrusion. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I forced calm. I stepped forward, gently but firmly grabbing Tony's arm. "Tony, come with me." I said. He hesitated, and Megan tilted her head. Don't you want to see the new issue with me? I ignored her. I led Tony to another aisle, making sure she saw that we were together but leaving just enough distance for her to stew in her frustration. That night, I realized that I couldn't just play defense. Megan was too bold. She needed to see that her actions had consequences, and that the battlefield was just as much mine as it was hers over the next few days. Her attacks became more deliberate. Texts that came late at night, comments about how Tony deserved someone more fun, even little rumors whispered in passing. I started documenting everything, keeping screenshots, notes, and recordings of interactions. Not to expose her publicly, not yet at least, but to protect myself and Tony, and secretly, to plan a way to end this once and for all. The real turning point happened one Friday evening. Tony and I were walking home from school, and Megan appeared at the corner, leaning against a lamppost like she owned the street. Hey, Tony, she called, with that same infuriating grin. Want to come to the concert with me this weekend? Tony hesitated. I could see the polite instinct to say yes flicker across his face. But I couldn't let her manipulate him like that in public. I stepped forward, took his hand, and said firmly, Sorry, Tony and I already have plans. Megan's smile didn't waver, but her eyes flashed something: anger, irritation, maybe even fear. Plans? With you? She asked, her tone a little too sharp. Yes, I said, voice steady. Plans with me. She lingered a moment longer, then smirked and walked away, but I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I realized that night that Megan was dangerous in a way I hadn't expected. She didn't just want Tony. She wanted control. She thrived on the idea of taking what didn't belong to her and bending it to her will. But I also realized that I wasn't powerless. I had patience, strategy, and a commitment to Tony that he didn't even know he needed from me. By Monday, my plan had evolved. I couldn't just keep reacting. I needed a direct, decisive action, a move that would make Tony, Megan, and even myself realize where we all stood. I called Lily that morning, explaining what I wanted to do. We need to confront her, I said, pacing my room. But it has to be smart, calm, and not dramatic. I want her to see that she can't play this game with us anymore. Lily nodded. You're right. But you have to pick the right moment. That moment arrived during the school's annual fall festival. Megan had been bragging all week that she'd get Tony alone during the haunted house event. I decided to go in early with Tony and stake our claim. The festival was chaotic, full of laughter, screaming kids, and pumpkin-themed games. Megan appeared, as expected, at the entrance of the haunted house. She caught sight of Tony and me, and her eyes narrowed. Hey, she called out, her voice sugary sweet. Fancy seeing you here. Tony smiled nervously. Hi, Megan. I stepped forward, my fingers laced together with his. We're going in together, I said, voice soft but assertive. Megan tilted her head, studying me. Oh, you think you can stop me? I laughed, a short, controlled laugh. No, I'm not stopping you. I'm just making it clear Tony and I are a team. And you can't break that. Her smile didn't falter, but the tension in her shoulders was obvious. She realized that her usual tactics weren't working. She tried to brush past us, insisting she go with Tony, but I subtly positioned myself between them. Tony looked at me, unsure, and I whispered, Trust me. That was the moment I knew the tides had shifted. Megan was frustrated. She had underestimated me. Her attacks had become aggressive, almost reckless. And with Tony's trust in me unwavering, I finally saw the path forward inside the haunted house. The darkness and shadows amplified the tension. Megan tried once more to get Tony alone, reaching for him, leaning in, whispering. I followed silently, letting her play out her moves. But when Tony glanced at me, the understanding passed. Between us was enough. I grabbed his hand, gently but firmly, and whispered, Let's go. Megan glared, realizing she had lost control. She stormed off, muttering something under her breath, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in her eyes. She knew. She couldn't manipulate Tony, and she couldn't intimidate me afterward. Outside the haunted house, I hugged Tony tightly. "I've got your back," I whispered. "No one's coming between us." Tony smiled, relief and admiration in his eyes. "I know," he said, "and I trust you completely." For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension lift. Megan wouldn't give up easily, but she had learned that Tony wasn't hers to take. And I wasn't going to allow anyone to try. The battlefield had been chaotic, full of subtle moves, strategic plays, and emotional warfare. But in the end, persistence, trust, and careful planning had won. After the haunted house incident, Megan didn't just quietly back off. That would have been too easy. Instead, she escalated, but in a more subtle, more manipulative way. She knew that open attacks had failed, so she started to work behind the scenes, planting tiny seeds of doubt. A casual comment here. "I think Tony seems a little distant these days, don't you think?" A sly text there to mutual friends. "Tony really seems like he's drifting." At first, I wanted to confront her openly, but I reminded myself that Megan thrived on drama. If I gave her the fight she wanted, she would use it against me. Instead, I documented everything meticulously. Screenshots of texts, notes from conversations, details of times and places. Every little manipulation, no matter how small, was logged. This became my weapon, not for vengeance, but for clarity. And protection. I also realized something crucial. Tony had been unknowingly caught in Megan's web. He wasn't malicious. He was polite, trusting, and conflict-averse. But Megan's subtlety had managed to confuse him. I needed to bring him fully into the loop without making him feel guilty or defensive. One evening, I invited him over, notebook in hand. "Tony, I want to show you something," I said. "I've been keeping track of Megan, her behavior, the texts, the way she's tried to manipulate situations." He looked nervous but curious. "Okay," he said, taking a seat. I walked him through everything, carefully explaining each incident without exaggeration. I emphasized that this wasn't about shaming Megan but about showing patterns, helping him see what was happening. As Tony read through the pages, I watched his expression change from confusion to realization. "I had no idea," he whispered. "I didn't notice any of this. I just thought she was being friendly." "I know," I said gently. "And it's not your fault. That's exactly how she wanted it. But now we can be aware and we can protect our relationship together." From that moment, we became a team, not just partners, but strategists working together. Tony began establishing his own boundaries, politely declining Megan's invites, avoiding one-on-one encounters, and reaffirming his commitment to me without any drama. I stayed close, visible, confident, and supportive. Every small victory felt like a silent reminder to Megan. We were united and we weren't going to be shaken. The turning point arrived with the party she had organized. Megan had meticulously crafted the evening to isolate Tony, making herself appear fun and irresistible while subtly undermining me. We knew this would be her perfect setup. So Tony and I planned our approach. We arrived together, hand in hand, greeting friends and taking the initiative to engage with groups rather than letting Megan dictate the flow. Almost immediately, her presence became obvious. The way she leaned toward Tony, tried to monopolize conversations, subtly undercut me with jokes that painted me as less fun. But this time, everything was different. Tony wasn't passive anymore. He met each of her attempts with polite firmness, clearly signaling his boundaries. And I remained visible, confident, and unshakable. Every time Megan tried to isolate him, our teamwork foiled her. At one point, she cornered Tony in the kitchen, smiling and leaning close. I walked over slowly, deliberately placing a hand on Tony's arm. "Everything okay?" I asked lightly. Megan's smile faltered. "Yes," she said, a little too tightly before retreating later that night, outside in the cool air. Megan tried one last move towards me, a forced calm, like a storm holding back for one final strike. "You think you've won, huh?" she asked, voice edged with tension. I looked her straight in the eye. "No, I know I've won. You've tried every tactic, every manipulation, and it hasn't worked. You can't force people to care about you or control them. This isn't a game. You don't get to play with people's feelings. Her eyes flashed with anger, frustration, and the tiniest hint of fear. For the first time, I saw cracks in her confidence. The smirk she had used to intimidate others for months was gone. She left without another word. I stood there and realized. Tony and I had not only survived her schemes, but had grown stronger because of them. The weeks following the party were a lesson in resilience. Megan tried minor manipulations here and there, carefully worded comments in passing, attempts to draw attention to herself, but the momentum had shifted. Friends who had admired her confidence began seeing the cracks. How she overreached. How she tried to manipulate rather than connect. Megan had lost her subtle influence, and her presence felt smaller and less threatening. Tony and I took time to rebuild our normalcy, enjoying the freedom from constant vigilance. We laughed more, communicated better, and celebrated the little victories that came from being a true team. We had strengthened our relationship not in spite of the struggle but because of it. The shared experience had forged a bond rooted in trust, understanding, and mutual protection. One afternoon, I suggested we revisit the comic book store, our original safe space before Megan's interference. Tony smiled, taking my hand. "It feels good to come back here, doesn't it?" He said. "It does," I replied, "and it's ours again." Afterwards, we reflected on the lessons we had learned over coffee. I told Tony about how documenting events, staying calm, and acting strategically had given me control. He shared how realizing the depth of my commitment helped him trust his instincts and set boundaries confidently. Together, we realized that the challenge had been a test, but we had passed it. Meanwhile, Megan faded from prominence. She tried the occasional sly comment, a small attempt at influence, but the confidence that had once intimidated us had disappeared. Friends who had once been swayed by her charm began noticing the contrast. Our loyalty, communication, and genuine connection. She became a cautionary tale rather than a threat, a reminder that manipulation can only work until someone refuses to be manipulated. By the end of the school year, our relationship was stronger than ever. Megan had lost her power. Tony had grown more self-aware and confident, and I had discovered a resilience within myself I hadn't realized existed. On the final day, standing outside the school, Tony turned to me and said, "We didn't just survive her, Nora, we came out stronger. Together." I laughed softly, feeling the weight of the past few months lift. "We did," I agreed. "And anyone who tries to mess with us in the future will know better." As we walked home hand in hand, I felt a deep sense of victory. Megan had been a villain in our story, but her attempts only highlighted the strength of trust, teamwork, and loyalty. In the end, reality, love, and connection had triumphed over manipulation. High school drama had tested us, but it had also shown us what we were capable of. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a profound, unshakable peace. The storm was over. Tony and I were free to live our lives together, stronger, wiser, and happier than ever.